Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today well, it's a little bit of a morbid topic, I suppose, but we're diving into the world of forensic medicine
Oh, yes.
and trying to figure out how experts can tell if someone had brain edema, swelling of the brain,
Right.
after they've already passed away. So we're
Hmm.
talking post-mortem. And we've got a really fascinating study here that dives into the nitty-gritty of how they actually figure that out. So
Yeah.
let's jump right in.
Yeah, it's a really interesting challenge
Okay.
because brain edema can be, very serious and even fatal.
Right, of course.
But when someone has passed away, there are other changes that happen in the body.
Oh, so it's not as easy as just
It can make it look like there's brain edema when maybe there wasn't.
it complicates
Let's
the.
have you- Yeah, it's like trying to solve a puzzle, but some of the pieces might be misleading.
Oh, that's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
So where do they even begin with this? I mean, what's the first step in figuring out if someone had brain edema after they've died?
Well, the traditional method is what we call macroscopic evaluation.
Okay.
And that basically means the pathologist is visually examining the brain during the autopsy.
Okay, so it's like a visual inspection.
Exactly. They're looking for specific signs that suggest swelling.
Like what kinds of signs?
Well, one thing they look for is something called flattened gyri.
Flattened gyri.
Yeah, those are the ridges on the surface of the brain.
Okay, so like if you picture a walnut, all the little wrinkles and bumps.
Exactly. And if there's swelling, those ridges can get kind of pushed down and flattened.
So it looks smoother.
Yeah, exactly. Less defined.
Interesting.
They also look at the sulci, which are the grooves between the gyri.
Okay.
And if those are narrowed, that can be another indication.
So it's all about looking for these subtle changes in shape.
Precisely.
Okay, so it's a very visual thing, but isn't that kind of subjective? Like, couldn't two different pathologists looking at the same brain come to different conclusions?
You're absolutely right. There is an element of subjectivity to it.
Yeah.
It relies on the pathologist's training, their experience.
Right, of course.
So there's always a chance for some variation in interpretation.
I see.
It's not a perfect system, but it's a good starting point.
Okay, so if the visual inspection isn't always definitive, what other tools do they have at their disposal?
That's a great question, and that's where things get even more interesting. So we'll dive into some of those other methods right after this.
So I'm guessing they don't just rely on the naked eye for this, right? There's got to be some high-tech stuff involved, too.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about eyeballing it anymore.
Okay, so what other methods are out there?
Well, one technique they use is called histology.
Histology sounds impressive.
It sounds fancy, but it's basically like looking at the brain under a microscope.
Okay, so zooming in on the cells themselves.
Exactly. They take thin slices of the brain tissue.
Oh, wow. So they're actually cutting it up.
Yeah, and then they examine these slices under a microscope to see if there are any cellular changes that are consistent with edema.
So it's like going from a magnifying glass to a high-powered microscope. You're looking for clues at a much deeper level.
Precisely. It's much more detailed than just looking at the overall shape of the brain.
Fascinating. What else?
Another method is called the wet-dry weight method.
The wet dry weight. Okay, that sounds interesting.
This one's pretty cool. They basically take a sample of the brain tissue
Okay.
and they weigh it,
Okay.
and then they dehydrate it completely, remove all the water.
Ah, so you're finding out how much water was in there in the first place.
Exactly. And by comparing the wet weight to the dry weight, they can get a sense of how much water was in the tissue, which can indicate edema.
It's like weighing a grape and then weighing a raisin.
That's a great analogy. The grape's full of water, the raisin's all dried up.
Exactly. So you can tell if the brain was more like a grape or a raisin, so to speak.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, so we've got the visual inspection, we've got histology with the microscopes, and the wet dry weight method, but which one is the most reliable? Did this study actually, reveal a winner?
Well, that's the thing. It's not always so straightforward.
Okay, so there's no magic bullet here.
Not exactly. Each method has its own limitations, and that's what makes this research so important.
So tell me more about these limitations. What did they find?
Well, with histology, even though you're looking at the cells in detail, there's still a degree of subjectivity.
Really? I would thought that would be the most accurate.
You would think so, right? But it turns out that different pathologists looking at the same slides might interpret the findings slightly differently.
Oh, so it's not as simple as just matching up patterns.
Right, there's still some element of human judgment involved.
Interesting.
And with the wet-dry weight method, it's not always accurate across all parts of the brain.
Really? So where does it work well?
It seems to be most effective in certain areas like the cortex.
The cortex, that's the outer layer.
Exactly, the thinking part of the brain.
The command center. Okay.
Yeah, and in that area, the wet dry weight method did a pretty good job of distinguishing between brains with edema and those without.
Okay, so it's got some strengths, but it's not perfect.
Exactly.
So what about this fourth method? Normalized cerebral weight. That one sounds intriguing.
Ah, yes. Now this one is where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears. So this normalized cerebral weight thing, it almost sounds like they're comparing a before and after picture.
That's a great way to think about it.
But instead of pictures, it's a brain scan.
Exactly. So they'll often do a CT scan before an autopsy.
Okay.
And they can use that scan to measure the brain's volume while it's still in the skull.
Ah, so it's like a digital blueprint.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And then they compare that volume measurement to the actual weight of the brain once it's been removed.
So you're looking at the difference between the estimated weight based on the scan and the actual weight.
Exactly. And that difference can tell you a lot about whether there was swelling.
And what did they find? Was this method more accurate?
It was. This normalized cerebral weight method turned out to be the most consistent and objective of all the methods they tested.
Wow, so it really seems like using these pre-autopsy scans could be a game changer in these investigations.
Absolutely. It gives them a whole new level of accuracy.
That's incredible, but I imagine this is about more than just having a really precise way to measure brain swelling after death, right? What are the broader implications here?
You're absolutely right. This has huge implications for all sorts of things.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, accurately diagnosing brain edema after death is crucial in legal cases.
Oh, right, because it could help determine the cause of death.
Exactly. Was it natural causes, an injury, something else entirely? This kind of information can be crucial in figuring that out.
That makes a lot of sense, and I'm guessing it also has implications for medical research, right?
Absolutely.
Hmm.
The more we understand about brain edema, how to identify it, what causes it,
Right.
the better equipped we are to develop treatments and
Mhm.
potentially even prevent it in the future.
So this study is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we still need to learn.
Precisely. And the fact that they're finding new and more accurate ways to diagnose it after death,
Yeah.
that just opens up all sorts of new avenues for research.
Well, it's definitely given me a lot to think about. I've learned a ton.
Me too. It's amazing what they can do these days.
So for our listeners who maybe couldn't take notes quite as fast as us, what's the one big takeaway from this deep dive?
I'd say the main takeaway is that figuring out if someone had brain edema after they've passed away is a lot more complicated than it seems.
Right. It's not just a simple yes or no.
Exactly. And this study highlights the importance of finding the most objective and reliable methods to do that, which it seems like they're well on their way to doing.
It's like you said earlier, it's a puzzle, and sometimes the pieces don't fit together quite as neatly as we'd like.
Exactly, but that's what makes it so interesting.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of brain edema and forensic medicine. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.